it's really a real honor that Benny is here. Benny is from Israel, born in Israel, grew up in Jerusalem and New York. He studied at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at Cambridge University. He was a journalist at the Jerusalem Post for more than a decade, has been teaching Middle East history at Ben Gurion University since 1997. He's written many important books on the Israeli-Arab conflict, most of which appeared from Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Yale University Press. And he has a book that's coming out with a colleague, a massive book on Turkey and the Christian genocide in Turkey, a subject that has been often overlooked in the academy. And I'll just say, on a personal level, I think one of the things that I respect about Benny is, in the spirit of being a true scholar, of trying to shed light where there's darkness, Benny's always been sort of following his path of truth and writing about things that often annoy people on one side of the issue or on the other. And I think is a sign of an amazing scholar. So it's really an honor that you're here. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I was asked to talk about the 1948 war, and perhaps with some of the lasting legacies of that war to this day. But I'll focus on it and hint at what it means for the present as I go along. Firstly, 1948, which was the first of the Israeli-Arab wars. There's 5, 6, 7, depends how you count. Since then, 48 was the most important of the Arab-Israeli wars. That changed the geopolitics of the region permanently, or as far as we can see at the moment, permanently, by injecting a Jewish state into the center of the Arab world and the Muslim world, and in fact cutting it in two. The Arab world and the Muslim world, something, the significance of which many Israelis didn't really understand. It has had a lasting significance on Muslim and Arab consciousness, this Jewish state cutting them in two halves, when you're supposed to be one ummah, one nation. It had lasting impact by injecting the Jewish state into the Middle East and by creating, essentially destroying Palestinian society, Palestinian Arab society in the course of that war, which resulted in a large refugee problem, which became ever larger as you added the second and third and fourth generations of exiled Palestinians to the roster of refugees. Today there are 5 million Palestinian refugees on the United Nations rolls. It's a unique situation, but anyhow, you have this lasting refugee problem with large refugee concentrations in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Transjordan or Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan today, and Syria and Lebanon. And that still remains probably the crucial issue dividing Israelis and Palestinians whenever there's talk about peace or possible peace or a possible agreement. The refugee problem looms largest, maybe next to Jerusalem, but I think it's more Jerusalem is a more soluble problem than the Palestinian refugee problem. As you all know, I'll just add one sentence, again bringing the subject to the present. The Israelis since 48 consistently have rejected what the Palestinians call the right of return. That is the demand by the Palestinians that Israel allow back to its territory the Palestinians and the second, third, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, to allow them back, arguing that a mass return of refugees would render the Jewish state an Arab majority state in Israel. Mix the Jewish state, and the Palestinians, for their part, have always demanded that Israel accept and recognize the right of return, and from that would flow implementation, which, from their perspective, would probably destroy the Jewish state. That's lies, I think, at the bottom of their wish for return, but there's also a candid wish for people to return to what they regard as their ancient land, their lands and houses and so on. And this is, these mutual positions are incompatible, so this stands as a major obstacle to any possible thought of peace. Now, the 48 war was the outcome of 70 years of struggle, the culmination of 70 years of struggle between incoming Jewish settlers who began to come to Palestine. They called themselves Zionists from 1882 onwards, under Turkish rule, later under British Mandate rule, And the Arabs in Palestine resisted growingly resisted their influx, regarding it as a sort of an invasion. Even though they bought land, they didn't conquer land. The Jews, when they set up their settlements and so on, it was done on land purchased from Arabs, sold by Arabs to Jews quite willingly, but nonetheless they regarded this influx as an invasion. And at the end they resisted it periodically with growing bouts of violence, and 48 was the big bout of violence in which they tried to stop Zionism and to crush the Zionist enterprise. We'll come to what exactly motivated them later, the Palestinians in the 48 war. The trigger to the war was the passage of the United Nations Partition Resolution 181, General Assembly, in 29th of November 47, which proposed, this was the international community's ruling on what is a fair or just settlement to this conflict of 50 years between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The international community decided the best solution is to cut the country in half, a Solomonic proposal, giving the Jews a state and the Palestinian Arabs a state. Two states in the land. The Palestinians rejected that proposal, said all of Palestine belongs to us. The Arab states supported the Palestinians in this, and they went to war against the resolution. The Jewish side, the mainstream of the Jewish side, led by Ben Gurion, who was head of the Jewish Agency, later Israel's first prime minister and defense minister, Chaim Weizmann, Israel's the head of the World Zionist Organization, later the first president of Israel, they led the acceptance, the majority of the mainstream in the acceptance of the resolution, even though there were some wings of the Zionist movement which rejected the resolution, but they were a minority. The majority said yes, and as I say, the Arabs of Palestine and subsequently the Arab states went to war. The war was divided. It was a very strange war, as wars go. All wars have peculiarities, but this one was really peculiar in that it divided more or less roughly in terms of chronology into two equal halves. The first half, from November 47 until mid-May 1948, was a civil war between the two ethnic groups in Palestine, the Jews in Palestine, the Palestinian Jews, and the Arabs in Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs. The two communities fought each other with their militias. Each had militias. The Jewish militia was better organized, one of the reasons for its victory. The Arab militias weren't organized, they lost, but they fought each other for about 6 months. Now this civil war was peculiar in that it occurred while a third country was actually sovereign in the land and had troops in the land, the government in the land, and that was the British Mandate government. So the British were there, the Jews and Arabs under the British were really fighting each other, and the British are trying to sort it out in some way or calm the waters so that they can make a peaceful exit, to lose as few troops as possible as they leave. Jews and Arabs, of course, later said the British sided with the other side. Arabs said the Jews sided with the British in the Civil War. The Jews said they sided with the Arabs. But actually the British cleaved to a pretty neutral line, except that in the first months, when they still had a lot of troops in the country, they basically also, apart from being neutral, wanted to maintain law and order. That's what governments are supposed to do. So, and the Arabs were on the offensive. They were attacking the Jews in those first 4 months of the 47-48 war. So the British naturally ended up, the troops on the ground naturally ended up defending the Jews, Jewish convoys, Jewish settlements from Arab attack. By the time the Jews went over to the offensive in the Civil War in the beginning of April, which lasted from the beginning of April until mid-May, the Jewish second half of the Civil War, in which the Jews are on the offensive, the British were really on the way out. They sent out a lot of their troops. They had less inclination to interfere, because you lose troops if you begin to interfere in a civil war. So the British didn't really defend the Palestinians very much, and this, of course, left a sediment of bitterness, hatred, and a memory that the British had helped the Jews. But actually the British were trying to be as neutral as possible. And that's really the story. But that's about the Civil War. Now that was the first half of the 48 war, the Civil War half. Where the Palestinians were defeated in that second half of the Civil War, April and May, and then the Palestinian states intervened, sending their armies into Palestine the day after the Jewish state declared itself established. That is, Ben Gurion announced the state's establishment on the 14th of May. On the 15th of May, the Arab armies, 4 Arab armies, people often say 5, but actually Lebanon never sent in its army. It announced that it was sending in its army on radio, but actually its troops never crossed the border. So you've got Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt sending their troops across the River Jordan or across the borders into Palestine, intervening in effect against the establishment of this Jewish state the day before. Why they did this, we'll talk about this in a second. I've spent the past 30, well, not the past 30 years, the 30 years between, I don't know, the early 1980s and 2010 approximately, on and off looking at the war. I looked at the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, I looked at other things. Then I wrote in 2008 a general history of the war called 1948, a history of the first Arab-Israeli war. And what I'm going to tell you now are some of the conclusions of that book about summarizing the 1948 war. And the first conclusion I came to from the research in doing that book was to do with the nature of the 48 war. The nature of the war was traditionally accepted, conventional wisdom was that the war was a political national struggle between two national groups over a piece of territory, a territorial national war, politically motivated. It was unusual, incidentally, if that's the way you see it, it was unusual in that one side in that war wanted all of the country of the other side, in other words, the whole of Palestine, whereas most national struggles between national movements or states are over borderlands. France and Germany being famous, you know, fighting about Alsace-Lorraine 1870, 1914, 1940. You fight about borderlands. National movements and states usually fight about borderlands. The Germans never wanted to take all of France and turn it into part of Germany or vice versa. In the 48 war, the Palestinian demand was that there would be no Jewish state and that all of Palestine was theirs. In that sense, it was all of Palestine, which they wanted, if that was the nature of the war, a politically territorially motivated war. The Jewish side, from 1882 on, the Zionist movement had claimed all of Palestine as the Jewish patrimony. This was ancient Jewish land, this is the land we should have our state on. But in the 1930s, given international realities, given the Arab revolt against the British presence 36-39, given the weakness of the Zionist movement, given the need to find a safe haven for Jews from Europe, as Nazi Germany began to discriminate against the Jews with a Holocaust looming, in the 1930s, 37-38, one can actually date it, the Zionist movement gave up the claim to all of Palestine and said, we'll make do with part of Palestine. In fact, the British Peel Commission in 1937, the first to table the idea of partition as a solution to the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, the British Peel Commission said 20% of Palestine, 17% of Palestine should be Jewish, the rest basically should be Arab, apart from an area still controlled by Britain, which would include Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Zionist movement basically said to the partition idea, or the Peel partition concept, even though they wanted to renegotiate the percentages, but they said yes to the idea of partition, giving up the claim to all of Palestine. Okay, we'll make do with part of Palestine. The Arab national movement under Haj Amin al-Husseini said no to partition, as they were to do in 47. They said a blank, flat no. None of this belongs to the Jews. The Jews are robbers who've come from Eastern Europe. God knows why they've come here, why they're stealing our land, why the international community accepts the idea of giving the Jews part of our land. It's our land, why are they giving it to somebody else? And they said no in 37, and as they were to say no in 47. But what I'm saying is that the Jews went into the war of 48 ready to accept partition of some sort, not claiming the whole of the territory. So if you like, from their point of view, if the war was a territorial political war, it was about borderlands, it was about how much exactly of Palestine you would get, but not to do with the totality of the land, which was 10,000 square miles under the British Mandate Palestine. The United Nations had given the Jews 6,000 square miles of that 10,000 in the Partition Resolution of 1947, which is what the Jews said yes to. What I'm saying is that the war wasn't just a territorial, political, national struggle between two national movements. The war was also, from the Arab side, a jihad, a war of religion, a war against the infidel presence, the infidel claims. The Zionist enterprise was an infidel presence which was unacceptable in terms of the religious diktats. Now, how do I know that, and this needs more study incidentally. What I've done is skimmed the surface of Arab discourse at the time in 48 on the war. Much more research has to be done into that to verify what I'm telling you, which was that the war in some large measure, and it's difficult to quantify how much was it a political thing driving them in their minds, how much was it a religious element driving their desire to go to war in 47, 48. But from skimming the surface of the material, one can see that religion was very important in Arab minds in going to the war. Then the question is, what Arab minds are we talking about, and what makes a jihad? Is it just the clerics declaring jihad? Does that make it jihad? Is it the kings and prime ministers who have to say, yes, yes, we're going to on jihad? Or is it the populace? And then when you talk about the Arab populace in Palestine or outside of Palestine in 47, 48, they're illiterate. 99% of the population, not 99%, 92%, 95% is illiterate. So they don't leave their thoughts on paper for you to know what they were thinking, why they're going to war. So what we have is the evidence really from the upper echelons. Sometimes kings and prime ministers made statements which have jihad in them, and we have clerics who made their feelings and thoughts known. On the 2nd of December 1947, and this I think is a crucial piece of evidence in supporting the idea that the war was also jihad. I'm not saying it wasn't a political territorial war by a national movement on their part, but it was also a jihadi war. On the 2nd of December 1947, the ulama of Al-Azhar University, there's the Council of Theologians, the Council of Wise Men of Al-Azhar University, this council being the most prominent interpreter of divine will, of Allah's will, of religion in the Sunni world. The Sunni Arab world, Sunni Arabs are the majority in the Arab world. The Shiites are a small minority. The majority is Sunni. They don't have a pope. There's no pope in the Arab world or in the Muslim world. There are different centers of religious authority. The most important center of authority in the Arab world in 1947, as incidentally today, is the ulama of Al-Azhar University. And they declared on the 2nd of December 1947, jihad, calling on the Muslims of the world to unite in throwing the Jews out of Palestine and preventing the emergence of a Jewish state. They declared jihad. All able-bodied Muslims should join, all who are not able-bodied should send some money. That's what we've now declared. The Arab world is, it's an imperative that they must fight against this. The Muslim world must fight against this establishment of a Jewish state and this Jewish enterprise in Palestine. The ulama of Al-Azhar University, chaired by the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the rector of Al-Azhar, who's the most important figure on that committee, redeclared jihad in April 1948, 5 months later, after the civil war had been raging for 5 months. In April 48, and why in April 48? Because the Arab states were about to invade, including the Egyptian army, were about to invade Palestine. In April, they declared again jihad against the Jewish, emergent Jewish state. And they declared jihad a third time. They gave 3 fatwas of jihad, the ulama of Al-Azhar. The third one being in December 48, by which time the Arab states had lost in the war. They'd invaded Palestine, been defeated by the Jewish army, the IDF by then. And still they were declaring jihad again in December 48, meaning essentially, we've lost this round, the jihad must be ongoing and must be renewed later when we have a chance or when we're powerful enough or whatever. So from that, other places also issued calls of jihad, other priests, other clerics in various parts of the Arab world, but this has to be more thoroughly researched. I haven't done that. But there are indications that the idea of jihad was in the minds of the Arab side as it was going to war. I'm not saying it's the only thing in their minds. They had other reasons to go to war, but that was in their minds. In January 1940, I'll give you just 2 small pieces of evidence. In January 1948, 2 months into the civil war, half of the 48 war, a woman called Batiel Murana, who was a Christian from Lebanon, who moved to Palestine and married a Muslim in Palestine, and was the head of a little organization, the Palestinian Arab Women's Organization it was called, which was the women's affiliate of the Higher Arab Committee. The Arab Higher Committee, the AHC, was the governing body of the Palestinian Arab National Movement from 36, when it was founded, until basically 48. It was the governing body of the national movement of the Palestinian Arabs, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini. At first he was in Palestine. In 48 he was already living in Cairo. Since 37 he was already living in Cairo. But he headed the Arab Higher Committee. And it had this woman's affiliate, and this woman, Matiel Muranam, was the head of that branch affiliation or group of women in the Arab Higher Committee, living in Jerusalem, married to a Muslim. This woman declared in an interview in January 1948, and that's why I'm giving, because I think it's a good indication of the mindset of the Arabs as they were involved with this civil war. The UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders, to whom, of course, the Arabs often compared the Zionist enterprise. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. This is what she said in an interview. Now, this is a Christian woman from Lebanon, but she's talking as if she's a Palestinian Arab. This is the way they're thinking. In August 48, a man called Emil Ruri, who was one of the Christian members of that Arab Higher Committee, already in exile, most of them were in exile in the course of the war. They didn't actually come to Palestine to fight or lead the fight. They led it from Cairo mostly. Emil Ruri declared in August 1948, after the Palestinians had lost the civil war and the Arab states had invaded Palestine and were engaged in battle with the Jews, he said in an interview, I think it was the Daily Telegraph here, "We must inculcate in the heart of every Arab," Emil Ruri incidentally, the word Emil of course indicates he was Christian, not Muslim. "We must inculcate in the heart of every Arab hatred for the Jews, and we must renew the Jihad against Israel." That's what he told the interviewers. Again, what I'm trying to say is this was the mindset, this is the way they were thinking. I'm not saying there wasn't politics in it, there wasn't a national movement trying to fight against a competitor, a competing national movement, but there was also this perception that what was going on in Arab minds was a jihad. So the nature of the war, it was a political national struggle between national groups and then between states, but it was also a religious war on the part of the Arab states and the Arabs of Palestine. It wasn't a religious war, and it wasn't a jihad on the Jewish side. Why wasn't it a jihad? When you look at Israel today, religion and religious parties and religious people are in great numbers. There's a third of the population perhaps is religious Jews today in Israel. Maybe a third, maybe a quarter, something like that. In 1948, there were almost no religious Jews in Israel. The Zionist movement was founded by and led by and consisted of socialist and liberal Jews. Very few religious Jews. The ultra-Orthodox was 0.1% of the population. In other words, a tenth of 1% of the population, the ultra-Orthodox. And Orthodox Jews, maybe 2, 3, 4% of the population. Most people were not religious. The whole of Zionism was essentially a revolt against religion. It was a revolt against the world of their fathers. They were secular, they didn't believe in God. Israel's Declaration of Independence, the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, doesn't include the word God, as of course the American Declaration of Independence does. They didn't want the word God in there, so they used some phrase but, to cover themselves so religious people could also identify with the document, but God's name is not there. They were anti-religious, that's probably the right way to put it. So it wasn't seen by them, it was seen by the leadership of the Zionist movement in 48, the leaders of the State of Israel, which was established in May 48. It was seen by them as a war against the Arabs, as a political war. Not jihad, not religion. Religion had nothing to do with it. That's one thing I think I came up with as a conclusion in my study on the 48 war. The other thing, another thing which I thought of interest in looking at that war is the war aims of the two sides, or actually it's more than two sides. In the first half of the war, it's the Jews of Palestine and their political establishment and so on, on the other side, the Palestinian Arabs are not as well organized, but they have their own political leadership also. The war aims of these two leaderships and peoples, or groups. And then after May 48, of course, you have to bring into, when you think about war aims, you have to think about the different Arab states and their war aims, and the state of Israel as opposed to them and their war aims. Well, it's much easier to work out what were the aims of the sides on the Israeli side. And that is because the Israelis were ultra-literate. They wrote down everything. They have protocols of cabinet meetings before the cabinet exists, protocols of the Jewish agency executives meetings, protocols of the governing bodies of the main parties. It's all there. Everybody felt that he was taking part in history. Every major and every colonel and every sergeant and every official was busy writing down reports because they thought they were taking part in a historic, great historic enterprise, a great historic moment. And they wrote down what they were thinking, and we have abundant archives which are open. Israel is still a democratic society. It has archives, lots of archives. Every kibbutz has an archive, every town has an archive, every state agency has its collection of papers and archives. And most of it is open to scrutiny. So we know what the Arab Jewish side was thinking. We know what they were debating, what they were saying, what they were thinking as we go into the various stages of the war, including the armed forces. First, the Haganah, the main militia of the Jewish community in Palestine, which changes its name in June to the IDF, to the Israel Defense Forces. And from the Jewish side, it's clear that the war aim, the most important war aim in both halves of the war, the primary war aim was survival. To survive the onslaught of the Palestinian Arab militias in the civil war, and to survive the onslaught, and to survive as a state, not just as a community, the onslaught of the Arab states which invaded Palestine in 15th of May 1948. That's the primary aim. To that, I believe, two more war aims accrued in the course of the war. You can more or less place them in March, April 48, that is towards the end of the civil war, half of the war. March, April, and one of them I think is accepted by most historians, one of these additional two war aims, and one of them is still controversial among historians. The one which is not controversial and I think is accepted by most historians is that in the course of March, April 48, there was a switch in the Zionist mind and in the leadership and in the military leadership of the Zionist enterprise as it was 4 months into the Civil War. And that was that, okay, they want war, they've given us war, we will now take more territory, we'll take as much territory as we think we need, not just the 6,000 square miles the United Nations allotted to us in the Partition Resolution. And at the end of the war, the Zionists had added to the 6,000 square miles allotted of Palestine's 10,000 for a Jewish state, they added 2,000 more square miles. So this was in line with this switch in thinking to add territory. It's worth noting they didn't change their mindset to the extent of saying, okay, let's take all of Palestine. Let's completely erase the UN Partition Resolution and the idea of Palestinian statehood, and let's take the whole 10,000 square miles, which they could have done militarily at the end of the war. Israel was completely dominant by the end of the war. But they didn't do that. They just made do with the 8,000 square miles they ended up holding at the end of the war, say January, March 1949. But that definitely was added as a war aim. To add some territory, to give us a little more territory, to bring in settlers, to give us a little more breathing space along the borders, a little more territorial depth, and so on. Can I finish this point first? And then, that's the second war aim, which I think accrued, was added to the initial survival war aim of the Jewish side in the course of the war. The third war aim, and this is controversial, some historians dispute this, is that I think by March, certainly by April 48, the Zionist side, led by Ben-Gurion, thought in terms of reducing the number of Arabs who would remain in the Jewish state's territory. In other words, if you like, expulsion. Expel Arabs, ultimately. Expel Arabs if they don't flee. Expel Arabs from the area which is going to become the Jewish state because they have just fought against us, tried to destroy us. They will stay in the country. They will be disloyal citizens. A fifth column, a ready-made fifth column. Let's have as few as possible of these remain in our territory. Now, this never turned into official policy, but it was enacted, that is, in most areas, in most of the war from April onwards. When Arabs left, they were not allowed back. There was a decision not to allow the Arabs to return, those who fled their homes. That was official policy. But also there were generals and colonels and majors and captains and officials who also said, let's not keep them here, including Ben-Gurion. Let's try and make sure that they don't stave, which included expulsions in certain places in the course of the war. So that's the third war aim, reducing the number of Arabs in the Jewish state to be, in the area which will become the Jewish state. On the Arab side, it's more complicated, because they don't have archives, they don't have open archives. The Jordanians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Egyptians, they may have profound, full archives, but nobody knows because nobody's given access to it. Not Arab scholars, not Jewish scholars, not foreign scholars. They're closed, like all dictatorships, they do not open their archives. So nobody knows what's there. It's quite likely they don't have very good archives, but they may have good archives, but nobody knows what's there. And if you don't have the archives of the Arab states, and the Palestinians themselves didn't produce archives because they weren't a state and weren't very literate, and they didn't keep things, they didn't have this mindset of keeping historical material for future generations or anything, it's difficult to work out what exactly were their war aims, because we don't have their material. We don't know what they were saying in deliberations, in council, in cabinet, what the general staff was telling the colonels and majors to do in the field and so on. We don't really know. But we can guess. Certainly we have some statements. We've got foreign diplomats who talked to Arab leaders and even generals and so on in the course of this war. We have Israeli intelligence and foreign intelligence penetrating the Arab world and seeing what it's saying. You've got radio broadcasts monitored from the Arab side. So there is a certain amount of understanding of the Arabs. And you have what the Arabs were doing. That is, you have reports of where their armies crossed the border, where they marched. So you can sort of work out, or at least conjecture, what they were at, what they were going to do, what their aims were. Well, from the Palestinian side, to the best that it can be worked out, is that they probably wanted to create, Haj Amin al-Husseini and the Arab Higher Committee wanted to create chaos in Palestine by unleashing low-level civil war, which would then bring in the United Nations or whoever, and they would abort the idea of partition and the establishment of a Jewish state. In other words, chaos, anarchy would lead to international intervention or an inability by the Jewish side to establish their state. The idea was to abort the Jewish state, the emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine, from the Civil War up to May 1948. That's the Palestinians, but as I say, incidentally, one interesting thing about this is you very rarely hear, and Haj Amin al-Husseini, for example, never said it, throw the Jews into the sea. The Jews believed in Palestine in December 47, April, January, February, March, April, they believed that the Palestinians wanted to throw the Jews into the sea. They were unleashing this civil war, this guerrilla war against the Jews, in order to destroy the Jewish community in Palestine, the Zionist enterprise, called the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement community in Palestine, and to throw them into the sea. But they never used that phrase. That is, Haj Amin al-Husseini is nowhere quoted as using that phrase, and almost no other Arab leader also outside Palestine used that phrase. When the Arab states invade in May 1948, their leadership or their foreign ministries usually talk about entering Palestine, or they don't call it invading, entering Palestine in order to save their Palestinian brothers. Not to throw the Jews into the sea, but to save their Palestinian brothers who just lost the civil war against the Jews. Occasionally there's an Arab leader who will say we have to get rid of Zionism, something more vague than throwing the Jews into the sea. Of course they understood that the term throwing the Jews into the sea 3 years after the Holocaust, which sounds like a second Holocaust, wasn't exactly acceptable to the international community. So they were politic, they knew what not to say. Maybe they intended to throw the Jews into the sea, maybe they didn't. Maybe they understood they don't have the power to do that. But that wasn't what they declared as their war aim, and it's quite possible that that wasn't the war aim. So what was the war aim of the Arab states? Well, you've got a problem because you've got a number of different Arab states. But most of them, that is the three main invaders, three of the invaders, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, apparently wanted to vitally harm the Jewish state and eat away chunks of the Jewish state, to take and occupy, and if you like, maybe even annex, chunks of the Jewish state to themselves. That was certainly their war aim, if you look at the way their armies moved. It's quite possible that had they been able to, slice their way like a knife through butter and reach Tel Aviv and Haifa, maybe they would have taken the whole Jewish state. Maybe they would have also thrown the Jews into the sea. Maybe even if they hadn't intended it, mass murder would have occurred, a mass massacre would have occurred had that happened. But they didn't get there. They weren't able to beat the Jews. They didn't get to Tel Aviv, so there was no great massacre by Arabs of Jews. Maybe that wasn't intended in any case, but they did intend to vitally harm the Jewish state and take chunks of the Jewish state as allocated by the United Nations from the Jewish state. That's for sure if you look at what they were doing. Jordan is the problem here. Jordan, who was led by a king called Abdallah, a Hashemite king, had always in some way been friendly with the Yishuv, with the Jewish community and its leaders in the previous decades, the 40s, 30s, 20s. He never liked the Palestinians. He hated the Palestinian leader Hajj Amin al-Husseini. He preferred a Jewish state in Palestine as his neighbor, as Jordan's neighbor, to a Palestinian Arab state. He didn't like the Palestinians. And he also knew that, and he always wanted Abdallah, all of Palestine, in addition to Syria, maybe in Iraq as well. He wanted to enlarge his kingdom. He had these great visions of a large Hashemite Arab kingdom under himself, under Abdallah. This was what he strove for from the 20s on. But the Iraqis wouldn't let him in, and the Syrians didn't want him ruling Damascus, and so he had a hard time. Eventually, he thought, well, maybe I can get part of Palestine. So his main war aim, apparently, in going to war on the 15th of May 1948, was to take over the core areas allotted by the United Nations for Palestinian Arab statehood, meaning the West Bank, what we today call the West Bank, or an enlarged West Bank. That was what he wanted to do, occupy that. He didn't want war with the Jews. He also told people the Jews are going to win this war. He knew that from, unlike the other Arab leaders, he said that to people, we're going to lose this war if we fight the Jews. So he didn't want to fight the Jews, but he didn't want to occupy the area allotted to the Palestinian Arabs. And that's what he did. That's essentially what his army did. He ended up fighting the Jews because of the road to Jerusalem. We can go into that later, why they ended up fighting the Israelis and the Jordanians. But ultimately the war ended up with Jordan occupying the West Bank, and the Jews not taking the West Bank when they could have taken it at the end of the war in 2 or 3 days. It was an easy, the Israeli army numbered at the end of the war 110,000 men and women under arms, mostly men, under arms. The Jordanian army at the end of the 48 war numbered 14,000. And the Israelis were much more powerful, in every sense. So they could have just walked over the West Bank, but they decided not to. In fact, generals went to Ben Gurion and said, let's take the West Bank. 2 or 3 days I take the West Bank. The commander of Southern Front told Ben Gurion in March 49. And Ben Gurion said, no, that's what we've decided, with partitioning the land between us and the Jordanians. So the Jordanians they were part of the Arab coalition which invaded. They ended up fighting the Jews, but they didn't want to destroy the Jewish state. This wasn't their war aim. As I say, they probably didn't think it was realistic. That's in terms of war aims. A third thing a conclusion I came to in looking at the 48 war, and in part, incidentally, of course, all of this connects to modern day history, with the West Bank being the core of the future Palestinian state, if it ever arises, and so on. So the whole story of what happened in Jerusalem and the West Bank in 48, of course, is highly relevant to the current situation. A third element in my conclusions about the 48 war is that the war created 3 refugee problems. We always talk about the Palestinian refugee problem, and that is the refugee problem which exists to this day. But 3 refugee problems were created by the 48 war. The first one was 70,000 Jews. You may think the number is small, but 70,000 Jews was slightly more than 1/10 of the Jewish population in Palestine on the eve of the war. There were 630,000 Jews in Palestine in December 1947. 70,000 of them were displaced in the course of the war. Their villages were overrun by the Arabs. They fled certain areas. They sent away their women and children from border areas as refugees to Tel Aviv or Haifa or whatever. So 70,000 were displaced and became internal refugees in the course of the war. 1/10 of the population, say America went to war or whatever, and 1/10 of its population was displaced. We're talking about 30 million people displaced. So 70,000 was a large number for the Jews in Palestine. But the problem vanished because the Jews won the war. They reconquered almost all the areas which fell to Arab armies, except for the Etzion Bloc and the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. But they reconquered most of the areas, so people went back and resettled, and if they weren't going back, they were resettled somewhere else. And at the end of the war, there was no Israeli Jewish refugee problem. It was solved. The second refugee problem created, and we can talk about it more at length if you like, I spent quite a number of years studying it, is the creation of the Palestinian refugees, in which 700,000 were displaced from their homes in the course of the war. 700,000 of Palestine's 1.2 or 1.3 million Arabs, that's the number of all of Palestine, 700,000 were displaced from their homes. Most of the 700,000, incidentally, were displaced from one part of Palestine to another part of Palestine, not out of the country. In that sense, they're not really refugees at all, because the term refugee, if you look it up in the Oxford Dictionary or elsewhere, you'll find is displacement from your country as a result of war, persecution, whatever. That's what a refugee is, somebody who's been displaced by war, whatever, from his country. Most of these 700,000, about 500,000, were displaced from Jaffa to Nablus and so on. They were displaced from one part of Palestine to another part of Palestine. A third, approximately, were displaced out of the country, in other words, from Palestine to Transjordan, to Syria, or to Lebanon. And as I say, today there are 5 million Palestinian refugees on United Nations rolls under UNRWA, which means they're given money, they're given food supplies, they're given free education, and so on by the United Nations, meaning America basically pays for it. But 5 million are there, and if there's problem of return or whatever, there's somewhere between 5 and 6 million people are called refugees by the United Nations, recognized as such by the international community. So that's the second refugee problem, and that continues to exist. It continues to exist because they weren't allowed back by Israel at the end of the war to their homes and lands. Israel said no mass return, it'll destroy the Jewish state from within. And they weren't properly absorbed, the bulk of them, by the Arab states in which they landed. In other words, they went to Lebanon, they went to Syria, they went to Transjordan, but they weren't properly absorbed. What does that mean, they weren't properly absorbed? And today, say there are, I don't know, 500,000 Palestinians living in Lebanon. They did not receive citizenship, and they did not receive the right to work in Lebanon. To this day, most Palestinians, 90% or whatever it is, maybe some doctors can work, but 90% can't work. Not only don't they have citizenship, they can't work. In Syria, they weren't given citizenship, but they were allowed to work, Palestinian refugees, and their descendants, I'm looking for all of them today. In Jordan, which did give them citizenship, they were second-class citizens. They were allowed to work, they got citizenship, but they were mostly not relegated to menial jobs, but kept out of certain departments of government, certain civil parts of the civil service, certain types of work, and they felt discriminated against, and they often lived in what were called refugee camps, which are actually suburban slums. That is, they're large slums on the suburbs of cities, outside Amman, outside Erbil, and so on. You have to press something, probably. So in Jordan, they have rights, but they consider themselves and are in some ways discriminated against. They're not allowed into the officer corps of the Jordanian army, the security services, and so on. So they weren't properly absorbed. And the Palestinians themselves, that is the refugees themselves, and Palestinian organizations, the PLO from the 1960s on and so on, urged them to demand the right of return to come back. And since they're living in slums, they'd like to actually move back to what they regard as, live under their figs and under their lemon trees and whatever the idyllic homes in Palestine. A third refugee problem created by the war, and it wasn't created in 1948, but in the decade and a half subsequently, between 1949 and 64, was the refugeedom of 700,000 to 800,000 Jews who lived in Arab countries, the Jewish communities of the Arab world, who'd been there for thousands of years, some of them. In Iraq, there were 130,000 Jews. In Morocco, there were something like 400,000 Jews. In Egypt, there were tens of thousands. In Syria, tens of thousands. In Yemen, 70,000 Jews, and so on. All these people, except I think 4,000 Jews left in Morocco to this day, all these people essentially were driven out, I would say intimidated into flight. They weren't expelled. There weren't expulsion orders except in some rare cases, as in Egypt in 1956. But in the course of the years 49, 64, they were intimidated into flight by the governments under whom they lived in the Arab world and by the societies amid which they lived in the Arab world. They were told, you know, you shouldn't be here, you should get out, we're going to burn your synagogue, we're going to burn your family, get out. And essentially, they all fled eventually. From North Africa when the French left, or just after the French left, from other places already in 1949-50, Yemen, Iraq, and so on, they were intimidated into flight. Bombs, knifings, terrorist attacks in the streets of Alexandria and Cairo, the rest of community leaders in Iraq and Egypt in 1949-50, they were intimidated into flight and ended up as refugees. There is no Jewish refugee problem from the Arab world to this day because the Jews were absorbed. The Jews who fled all these various places as a result of this Arab intimidation ended up being absorbed in the countries in which they arrived. Most of them, the poor, and that was the vast bulk, ended up in Israel and were absorbed by Israel. There were problems in their absorption. To this day, there's ethnic problems within Israel between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews as a result, but they ended up being absorbed. They got homes, they got schools, they got jobs, and they ended up being absorbed, and the problem of the refugees vanished. The middle class, upper class went to France from North Africa, from Egypt and Iraq. They ended up in London, the upper class, but almost all of them were absorbed in Israel, and no refugee problem exists. So you do to this day, and this, if you like, brings it up to date in a sense, you do have Arabs or Jews of Arab extraction, from the Arab countries, and their descendants demanding compensation. Just as the Palestinians demand both the right of return and compensation for their lost properties, Jews from Arab lands, increasingly I would say, are raising their voice and demanding compensation for the vast amounts of wealth they left behind in Baghdad and Mosul, in Cairo, Alexandria, and so on. And the amount of wealth the Jews lost, property, money, and so on, is probably equivalent to and probably more than the Palestinians lost in terms of money value than the Palestinians lost in 48. And we're talking about large communities which actually were quite prosperous in Iraq, in Syria, and Egypt, and so on. So there is this demand for compensation which is growing, but of course the main difference is they were absorbed, so there's no refugee problem, and the Jews from Arab lands don't want to go back. The Palestinian refugees do want to go back, and they weren't absorbed. There's a connection, of course, between the two things. Okay, one last thing I'll talk about, and then I'll leave the floor open to questions, is the problem of balance of forces, or put another way, who was the stronger side in the 48 war? And as I said, it's really, you have to divide it in two: civil war, Palestinian Jews versus Palestinian Arabs, and then Arab states versus the state of Israel. Who was the stronger side? And this has moral weight. It's not just a question of counting numbers of tanks or soldiers, but there's a moral weight to the question. The liberal West, liberals in the West, tend to side with the underdog. Even if the underdog is actually quite a vicious dog, you side with the underdog. That's the norm. And it's understandable. The weaker side gets your sympathy. And if you manage to present yourself as the weaker side, you will get international sympathy, which may translate into money and political support and so on. And the Israelis very successfully did this in 48 and since 48. And how did they do this? Well, partly because they were the victims of aggression in the sense of the Arab side violating the United Nations Partition Resolution. But also, people just looked at a map and they saw this little Jewish community right in the middle there, surrounded by twice as many Arabs in Palestine and tens times more Arabs from around, a map stretching from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Obviously, they're the weaker side, and they remain the weaker side in that vast sense of potential Arab power, potential Arab numbers, economic power, political power around the world in the United Nations, etc. They are the weaker side. That's obvious when you look at the map. But what happened in 48 was actually the stronger side won, as incidentally happens in almost all wars. The stronger side wins. It's not usually God's intervention, but it's not a miracle. It's the stronger side wins. The question, of course, is what makes this one side in a conflict stronger? What are the components of strength and weakness in a conflict between societies or between states? And the Jewish side was stronger, ultimately, than the Palestinian Arab majority in Palestine, and even stronger than the Arab states around it in the 48 war. How was it stronger? Well, firstly, it had much stronger motivation. Certainly much stronger motivation vis-a-vis the Arab states there's the Jewish soldiers versus Arab soldiers from Iraq or Yemen or Egypt or whatever, because they were fighting for their own homes, lands, and families in Palestine with their backs to the sea, 3 years after the Holocaust. So they knew the Arabs, that's how they believed. The Arabs are going to kill us all and then kill our families. So they had strong motivation. The Arab soldiers from Iraq and Egypt, maybe they were driven by religious impulses as well, but they weren't as strongly motivated. They had somewhere to go back to, and they weren't fighting for their lives or their families' lives. The Jews had more money. Now this again might sound strange in the world of 2017. You know, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, God knows what. They have a lot of money, the Arab states today, but in 1948 they were poor. They were very poor. And the richer states, who also didn't get very much money from the oil companies at the time, they got 3% or something from the oil companies. Today they get 70% or whatever the take is. They weren't particularly generous to the frontline states. Saudi Arabia wasn't giving money to the Egyptians to fight. As I say, they were also poor in themselves. But the frontline states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, were poor states. They didn't have money. What that meant was that they weren't able to buy munitions and additional arms to finance, resupply and whatever during a war. Whereas the Jewish side was able to do that because they got $130 million, the Jewish side, that is, the Yishuv and the State of Israel, in 1948, got $130 million, mainly from American Jewry. $130 million then was a lot of money. It was billions of dollars in modern currency. So they were able to finance their war and buy whatever they needed arms-wise. Now, the Jews in pre-1948 Palestine were, and their militias, were an underground militia. They weren't a state buying arms from another state. So they had to bring in everything clandestinely. So they worked out fake shipping companies and fake everything, documents, and they knew how to bring in arms before 48 without people monitoring it, without people being able to stop it, under British eyes at the time. Then from May 1948, they used exactly the same methods against the United Nations observers who were supposed to impose an arms blockade. There was an arms blockade in all of Palestine and the Middle East from May 1948. They were able to circumvent this blockade and bring in the arms necessary. And they knew how to buy arms. They weren't getting them directly from Britain or France like the Arab armies had been since before 48, but they were able to buy them from the Czechs who wanted Yankee dollars, so they didn't care about United Nations resolutions and boycotts. And the Czechs may have sympathized with the Jews as well, having suffered under the Nazis. And they were able to buy arms in the black market in Europe and South America, and they knew how to bring in the arms, and the world was flooded with arms after World War II, so the things were available. The question was how you bring them in. The Israelis couldn't bring them in before the British left in mid-May, or couldn't bring in much of the material they were able to buy, but from 15th of May on, it was a question of how quickly they could bring the arms in, deploy them in the army, and use them. From that point on, essentially, it's like a graph which goes like this. The Arab side loses in terms of the weapons and munitions it uses in the war making, and the Jewish side increases in terms of munitions, armaments, and so on. So by the end of the war, the Jewish army is very strong. It's got enormous, stockpiles of weaponry, and the Arab sides don't. The Arab side also suffered from bad manpower, inexperienced manpower. The Jews had been lucky, if you like, you can call it that. The Jews in Palestine had served, 28,000 Jews from Palestine had served in World War II in the British Army. 28,000, which is a large number. And others had served in the Russian Army, the American Army, the Canadian Army, and some of these volunteered and came to Palestine to fight. The Arabs hadn't fought in World War II. Most of them sympathized with the German victory, not because they were Nazis, because they didn't like the British or the French. So they didn't fight in World War II, so they had no experience, except for a few hundred members of the Jordan's army, the Arab Legion. They were inexperienced. The Jordanian army was something different because it had British officers and had some part in fighting in World War II, so they had some experience. But by and large, the Arabs, in terms of the quality of manpower and experience in combat or experience in running an army, they were deficient, whereas the Jews had much more on their side. So in that sense also, the Jewish side was better. The last thing was superior in this balance of forces when you compare them. The last thing, and people always don't understand that, is that the Jews actually had more troops in the 48 war than the Arab side combined. They had more troops than the Palestinians probably, and certainly more troops in the field than all the Arab states combined in the theaters of operation in Palestine. And this is because the Arab states didn't mobilize properly. They didn't have that many arms and men under arms to send to the battlefield. They weren't able to, prepare them properly for war. They didn't actually prepare properly for war, except for the Jordanian army. So they ended up sending all together into the theater of operations in the 48 war. The maximum the Arab side has was about 60,000 troops. And as I said, the Israeli side had probably over 100,000 troops in the war at the end of the war. So even in terms of manpower, they were superior. Now you'll find when you talk to old Israelis that they say, but this isn't true. I mean, I was in kibbutz, whatever, and there were 500 Egyptians attacking us and we were only 60 people, and it's true. In specific areas and specific times, the Arabs, and they also had the initiative in in May 1948, they had more troops in a given spot than the Jews did, and the Jews felt terribly weak, vulnerable, inferior, etc. Kibbutz Nirim on the 16th or 17th of May held off an Egyptian battalion, 70 members of the kibbutz against 600 Egyptians with some artillery and armored cars and so on. And these guys just had rifles and bazookas or whatever. Piets, they didn't have bazookas, they were called piets. Projectile infantry anti-tank. It's a sort of a primitive bazooka. The point is that despite the memories people have, and in Jerusalem people felt embattled and surrounded and besieged, and the Arabs were stronger and so on, but actually when you break it down, when we now have the archives, Israeli archives, and we know what's what, and we have Israeli intelligence looking at the Arab armies and so on, we have the facts and figures, we know that the Arabs were actually weaker in the 48 war. As it turned out. If you look at the map, the Arabs were potentially much stronger, but they weren't able to bring it to bear. The main thing, incidentally, the main difference was to do with organization. The Jews were very well organized. From the beginning of the Zionist enterprise, they knew the Arabs were going to attack them and kill them if they could. So everything was organized for war. The kibbutzim was set up with perimeter fences and trench works and bunkers against the artillery and so on. Arab villages didn't have trench works, they didn't have perimeter fences, they didn't have perimeter lighting, they didn't have bunkers. So if you attacked an Arab village, you started shelling it, everybody ran away. They had nowhere to hide. In an Israeli kibbutz, nobody ran away. They just stayed in the trenches and bunkers and then came out. So the Yishuv was organized for war on this primitive level, but also more generally. The Arabs of Palestine had talked bluster. We're going to kill them all, we're going to drive them into the sea maybe, and so on, but they didn't organize for war. And the Arab states didn't organize either, except for Jordan, which is the only army which beat the Israelis in the 48 war. They kept them out of East Jerusalem, they kept them out of Latrun. Israel wasn't able to beat the Jordanian army. Certainly not in the middle of the war when the Israelis were weaker, in May, June. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about, and the floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much. So we'll take questions, and if people just signal to me, I'll write your name down. I'll just start with a quick question. You were mentioning some of the Lebanese Christian intellectuals were also echoing Husseini's call to jihad. And in the work that I'm doing, I'm looking at the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, there's definitely a connection between Nazism and the rhetoric of the anti-Semitism to the emerging reaction of Arab states to the Zionist movement. Given your work on the jihad and the history of the nation state of Israel, what's the cooperation between them? What's the impact of Nazism in the region?
Well, I've never studied that. I mean, I've come across things, but I've never actually studied it. And it's actually being investigated by researchers like Jeffrey Herf and so on, only in recent years. Certainly, there was a nexus between the Nazis and also the Italian fascist leadership and the Arab national movement, the Palestinian Arab national movement from the 30s, when Hitler comes to power In Germany, soon after January 1933, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the head of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, sends them a congratulatory telegram and says, we hope that there will be something similar coming into being here, some sort of movement with a proper hierarchy, with power and so on, among us Arabs. During the Arab revolt of 36-39, there was some fascist, maybe Nazi support for the Palestinian Arab revolt against the British and the Zionist enterprise, 36-39. Certainly there was propaganda support, in other words, broadcasts from Germany supporting and political support for the Arab revolt against the British, but you can contextualize that in the German-British antagonism leading up to World War II. Why we?
It's wobbling. We'll just keep going.
Okay.
We're going to show a film. We're going to show a film now.
Okay. Okay. Well, get organized. Now, Israeli propaganda, they gave political and propaganda support to the Palestinian Arab National Movement, the Germans, under Hitler. Whether they sent any arms or money to the Palestinian Arab National Movement during the revolt is unclear. Some Jews accused them of doing that, it's unclear. There may have been some Italian arms arriving for the rebels against the British, but again, this is to do with European politics. The Arabs under Haj Amin al-Husseini hated the Jews, and Haj Amin al-Husseini was an anti-Semite. He identified with Nazi hatred of the Jews and fear of the Jews. He had much more reason, of course, in Palestine than Hitler had in Germany, but that's an aside. In 1937, he fled Palestine. The British wanted to arrest him. He fled Palestine, ended up in Berlin in 1941, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and then ended up working for the Germans on salary from the German Foreign Ministry from 1941 until 1945. Haj Amin al-Husseini, he made broadcasts to the Arab world calling for a revolt against the British and French, to kill the Jews, broadcasts to the Middle East. Working for the Germans, he raised conscripts for the German army and for the SS, usually from Muslims in Europe, from Bosnia and so on, to fight against the Russians. So he helped the Germans, and as I say, he was paid a salary. He famously met Hitler in November 41, supposedly was friendly with Himmler, so he probably knew what was going on. He even sent the Holocaust I'm talking about, and sent cables and letters to various European prime ministers not to allow Jews to arrive in Palestine, which in some way helped consign them to the gas chambers. So in some way he had some sort of indirect role in the Holocaust, though he certainly wasn't a primary factor in the Holocaust. It was very marginal, but he probably knew what was going on and approved of it. Haj Amin al-Husseini, and there were other Arab leaders from Palestine and outside who supported the Nazis. There is a sort of a general. Nobody's investigated this thoroughly, but by and large, Arab public opinion during World War II, certainly when the Germans were winning the war up to 1942, supported an Axis victory. Arab public opinion, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, supported an Axis victory. And this is mostly explicable in terms of they didn't like the people who were occupying them, the British and the French. They wanted the British and French to lose the war. In addition to that, you've got anti-Semitism to some degree. It's not calculable how much of it was also anti-Jewish prejudice, which played a part in this. But certainly in the bulk of the Arab world, certainly while they were losing, while the West was losing the war, the Arabs supported the Axis powers, and maybe even later on. Egypt, incidentally, famously declared war on Germany, I think it was in April or May 1945. That was a few days before Hitler gave up, because they wanted to join the United Nations and be among the founders of the UN. You had to be on the Allied side to be one of the founders. But essentially, public opinion in the Arab world was pro-Axis, anti-Western and also anti-Jewish, because the Jews were seen as usurpers and thieves of Palestine. Now, did this answer any part of what you were talking about? Yeah. Look, in Lebanon, you mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon's a special case because it had a 40–50% population which was Christian. And the Christians of Lebanon, by and large, were anti-Semitic Christians, especially the Maronite Church, which Israel later, even before, and Israelis later, tried to make common cause with against the Muslims in Lebanon. That is, they thought they may have an ally in the Maronites of Lebanon, and in 1982, in fact, the Maronites became allies of Israel, just before 1982, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. But the Maronites never liked the Jews especially, and this is in line with Christian doctrine from way back. So you couldn't actually hope for much from the Christians in the Arab world. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Davros?
Thank you for your fantastic lecture. India was home to the world's largest Muslim population before its partition in 1947. It still is home to the world's second largest Muslim population. And the Islamic seminaries there, some of them are very prestigious, like Darul Uloom in Deoband and Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow. So I was wondering as to how did these Islamic seminaries respond to the Zionist enterprise? Did they also issue fatwas calling for jihad against Zionists and the newly emerging state of Israel?
I don't know. I don't know. I know nothing about the Indian Muslims. I know that India voted against partition, against the establishment of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state in Palestine. And I know famously that the Jews managed to mobilize Albert Einstein to send Nehru a letter to try and persuade him, because he'd been anti-Zionist before, as had been Gandhi in various public statements, to mobilize India nonetheless to support a partition and therefore a Jewish state in Palestine, and they said no. Nehru said no. Nehru basically said in his letters, I actually found the letters at some point, wrote about them in The Guardian. Nehru said, essentially, there were a number of arguments. One was that Nehru and the Congress Party saw the British as evil. The British were imperial conquerors, occupiers, and so on. And in Palestine, the British were also the occupiers and were seen as pro-Zionist, whereas the Arabs were the underdogs. So you identified with your third world brothers in that. That's one thing. But in his letter, Nehru, in saying, no, we cannot vote for a Jewish state in Palestine as part of a partition, he basically said nations have to, the letter's quite long, but there's a little section in it in which he actually reveals what's driving him. And it's not so much identity with the Arabs or that the Jews are evil or something, but that nations must work in line with their interests. Prime ministers have to govern in relation to what they see as the interests of their country and their people. And India's interests, because it has, as you say, a large Muslim minority, and also had enemies outside who were Muslim, and therefore would be fighting them in the United Nations and so on, you wanted to get as much Arab support as you could, or neutralize as much Arab support for Pakistan as you could. You must vote with the Arabs. That's what he basically said. Self-interest dictates that I have to vote this way. And that was that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this lecture. And a question about maybe how the Palestinian collective identity was created. How much the refugee status of half of the Palestinian population influenced the creation of the Palestinian identity, and how much it is prominent today in terms when you speak about the peace process. Was it possible to resolve the conflict or not?
Well, Palestinian identity is a controversial subject. It's not really clear when the Palestinians began to think as a separate Arab nation within the great Arab nation or Ummah. Most historians locate the beginning of Palestinian national consciousness and movement in the 1920s. And then there's a sort of a ripple, like you throw a stone in a pool and there's a ripple effect. So it moves from the aristocracy or from the intelligentsia, the ripple takes in wider and wider circles among Palestinians from the 1920s on. And then the question is when the process is completed. Because today we know there are millions of Palestinians who identify themselves as a Palestinian nation or Palestinian people, distinct from the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Iraqis, and so on. Without doubt, what happened in '48, I mean, most Palestinians, let me start differently. Most Palestinians during the 20s and 30s and 40s were primitive peasants. They were illiterate, and they didn't really understand what nations are. They were driven by a religious impulse against Zionism, but not so much by the idea of creating a Palestinian state. But without that, and not that many fought in the 1936-39 rebellion against the British and the Zionists, and not that many actually fought in the '48 war, if you think about numbers and joining the colors and so on. But without doubt, what happened in '48 itself, the great catastrophe of most of them turning into refugees, being displaced from their homes, and the country being set up, this country of Israel being set up, and no Palestinian state being set up, without doubt, '48 itself was a major factor in creating real Palestinian national identity. And Palestinians, incidentally, weren't active as a people politically on the international stage or the Middle Eastern stage between 1949 and '64. They were sort of knocked out of history by what had happened in '48. But they came back into history in the '60s, creating the PLO and then the guerrilla movements, the beginnings of attacks on Israel and so on. And from the '60s, you can sort of identify distinct Palestinian people, national consciousness and movement, in which the business of refugeedom is a core element. In a sense, it's a bit like Zionism, Palestinian nationalism, in the sense that the idea of return, of people returning to their land, as Zionists want the Jews to return to Palestine, that's the core element in the ethos, the political ethos of the Palestinian people. The idea of return, which is why it's so difficult and probably impossible to make peace. Because the idea of returning is unacceptable to the Israelis and won't happen so long as Israel's alive. But that's a core element in their identity. The whole, what happened, the tragedy of '48 and the refugee problem which emerged, which turned most Palestinians into what were called refugees.
Okay, so we'll take one more question. We'll have tea and we'll come back to continue.
So one of the major attacks on contemporary Israel is that Israel engaged in active ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the stages leading to and following the creation or establishment of Israel. So based on your extensive historical research, how would you respond to a claim like that?
Well, I've written a number of books on what happened in '48 in terms of Palestinians being displaced, and why that happened, and how it happened. I wouldn't use, because ethnic cleansing has got a bad name because of the Yugoslavs. Opening the window wasn't a good idea, because that's what's blowing down.
Close the window.
So there's gusts of wind outside of the That's another good idea. The Yugoslav experience, which ethnic cleansing meant kicking out people, killing them in large numbers, raping the women in large numbers, all of it systematic and organized, this isn't what happened in Palestine in '48. So if you want the blunt answer, it wasn't what happened in Palestine, ethnic cleansing. What did happen is that Palestinians were uprooted from, and in some places expelled or ethnically cleansed, but in most places they simply fled as a result of battle, without large-scale massacres and without almost any cases of rape. There were rapes, but very, very few. So there was an uprooting. I would use, if I had to use a phrase, I wouldn't say they were expelled, I would say they were driven out. They were driven out in the course of a war which they themselves had launched. Israelis, troops, that is Haganah troops, later IDF troops, conquered Arab villages which were the bases of the Arab militiamen who were attacking the Jews, as the Jewish settlements were the bases of the Jewish militias belonging to the Haganah who attacked the Arabs. So they conquered Arab villages, villagers fled, essentially. That's essentially what happened. And then the Israelis decided that from June '48 onwards, when about only half the Palestinian refugee problem had come into existence, in other words, half of the 700,000 had been uprooted from their homes, from June 1948, the policy was not to allow refugees back, not to allow them to return. So in that sense, what happened was an expulsion, in that sense, but not in the sense of them being expelled. Most fled in battle and weren't allowed to return. And most of the elements of what we call ethnic cleansing as a result of the Yugoslav experience, what characterized ethnic cleansing there, didn't exist in Palestine. What you had there was two populations fighting each other. You had a war, the Arabs having launched the war, the Jews retaliating, and eventually the Jews going over to the offensive and driving out Arab populations as part of military offensives, and later on, for political and military reasons, not letting them back. That's in short, but otherwise read the two books.
Okay, so we're going to take a break now, and the first